I just want to welcome everybody this afternoon. I'm Suzette Malveaux. I'm the director of the Byron White Center for the Study of American Constitutional Law here at the University of Colorado Law School. And I'm really grateful that so many of you could make it to our fall speaker series today. Many of you may know we've had a wonderful lineup of folks who have been speaking lunch talks once a month on Mondays. And we are really excited to have today with us Ellen Weintraub with the Federal Election Commission. So we're really, really grateful for that. And she's going to be sharing with us, speaking on the topic of regulating an unprecedented election. Let me first of all start by thanking people who have made this possible. First, I will start with Doug Spencer. He is a law professor who is visiting the White Center this year as our distinguished faculty fellow, an expert in election law and voting rights law as well. So really grateful to Professor Spencer for organizing the speaker series. So I'm very appreciative. I also want to thank Leonard Pollard. Leonard is one of our student leaders, law student, and also a White Center Fellow who's going to be moderating the discussion today and taking your questions after the presentation. And of course, I just want to do a shout out to the IT folks who are basically making all this magic happen in the background. So thank you so much. We never know if they're going to need to rescue us at any point in time, so hang tight. So I just want to sort of set the frame for us here and just say that, obviously this is a really important time to have this conversation about voting and elections. And, our democracy is being challenged every day severely. We have a lot of challenges. We have voter suppression. We have challenges related to a global pandemic. We are in the midst of a racial justice movement in this country. So there is no dearth of issues that we are confronting today. And I know that it may seem that this level of complexity is unprecedented. And so I'm grateful to hear from Ellen how we might manage some of these challenges. But I'm also reminded about how it has been worse, and that just the right to vote has been on the backs of so many people. I think of activist John Lewis, who got beaten severely trying to fight for the right to vote. I think about the number of activists who have been killed in our country just to be able to have the franchise and to ultimately get us the Voting Rights Act of 1965. So it's been rough. It's been worse, but we are at such a critical time, and it's such an important topic to our democracy. So I'm just very grateful and excited to learn about your insights and where we go from here, how we deal with some of those challenges and continue to protect this really, really important right that we have and part of our democracy. So let me hand it over to Leonard, who will take it from here. Video and audio mute. Thank you so much.
All right, thank you, Professor Malveaux. As you might have heard, my name is Leonard Pollard. I am your moderator. I am also the student president of ACS's CU chapter. It's a mouthful. We're a progressive legal organization. We have lawyer chapters as well as student chapters. So to just kind of introduce the prestigious career of Commissioner Weintraub. Ellen Weintraub has served as a commissioner on the U.S. Federal Election Commission since 2002 and chaired it for a third time in 2019. During her tenure, Commissioner Weintraub has served as a consistent vote for meaningful campaign finance law enforcement and robust disclosure. She believes that strong and fair regulation of money in politics is important to prevent corruption and maintain the faith of the American people in democracy. It's important. Commissioner Weintraub sounded the alarm early and continues to do so regarding the potential for corporate and dark money spending to become a vehicle for foreign influence in elections. She has also urged social media companies to abolish the practice of micro-targeting, which has contributed to the rise in misinformation and divisive messaging in political ads. Commissioner Weintraub has advocated for patience and calm during November's election, writing in the New York Times that, quote, taking the time for an accurate count will enhance legitimacy of election, not undermine it, unquote. Commissioner Weintraub is active on Twitter, and you can follow her at Ellen L. Weintraub. That's WEINTRAUB. We are very lucky to be able to listen to her in real time today on behalf of the Colorado Law ACS chapter and the White Center. Take it away, Commissioner Weintraub.
Well, thank you so much, Leonard, and thank you to all of you for showing up and listening. I'm delighted to virtually be in Colorado with you. Actually, I'm obviously still sitting in my own home. Regulating an unprecedented election. One of the many unprecedented things about this election is that the Federal Election Commission, which is the body that is charged with regulating money in politics at the federal level for the presidential race, as well as the Senate and the House races. Right now, although we are supposed to have 6 members, we only have 3, and it takes a quorum of 4 to make any of our major decisions, including on new regulations or on enforcement decisions. So one of the unprecedented things about this election is that the Federal Election Commission actually isn't doing much regulating right now, and that's not a good thing. As you know, the Constitution, since this is a constitutional law series, says that the time, place, and manner of elections is left to the states. So it is, fortunately, despite the fact that we cannot do all of the things that we should be doing, that doesn't mean the election's not going to go on. The election's going to be run by your state and local officials who've been working night and day to try and deal with all of the unprecedented aspects of this election. Unfortunately, the Brennan Center at NYU estimated earlier this year that it would take an extra $4 billion to run this election properly under these unusual circumstances, with all the ramped up mail-in voting, as well as making sure that in-person voting could be done safely. Congress promptly allocated $400 million, about 10% of what was needed. And despite a lot of back and forth between the House and the Senate and the president, they haven't managed to allocate anything further. Now, Mark Zuckerberg and his wife Priscilla Chan threw in an extra $300 million. I have a lot of criticisms of Facebook's role in our democracy, but that was very nice of them and generous. Arnold Schwarzenegger, the former governor of California, is offering grants to local counties who are having trouble finding the money to run their elections. Many companies are offering their workers, their employees, paid time off, either to be poll workers or to vote. And basketball teams have donated their arenas to have safe arenas, big spaces where in-person voting could take place. So a lot of people are chipping in here, but we're kind of running this election like a GoFundMe campaign, which I think is kind of sad for the great and wonderful democracy that we have here in America. So that's one problem with money in politics that I can't do anything about, unfortunately. So let's talk a little bit about money in politics. Again, going back to the Constitution, the First Amendment says that Congress shall make no law abridging the freedom of speech. Doesn't actually say anything about money, but the Supreme Court, when they read those words, sees money in there. They say, well, if you limit the amount of money that's spent in our elections, you will, by definition, be limiting the amount of political speech that can take place, and that would be a bad thing. So there can be no limits on the amount of money that is spent. There are contribution limits as far as money that goes directly to candidates and party committees, because they claim that there's an inherent risk, and I believe them on this part. There's an inherent risk of corruption when you have unlimited contributions going to candidates. They see no risk of corruption, however, when it comes to money that is not going directly to the candidates, and that's how we get super PACs spending the billions of dollars that they spend in our elections. There have been estimates that this election may cost as much as $11 billion with a B, dollars, which is a whole lot of money and a huge increase over 2016, the last presidential election, where we only spent a modest $6.5 billion. Now, I know that still sounds like a lot of money, but most of the years that I have been tracking elections, I like to look at how much money was spent for Halloween, which takes place usually about a week before the election. And remarkably enough, usually Halloween costs more. We usually spend more money on Halloween than we do on the election. The National Retail Federation estimated that we spent $8.8 billion, billion with a B, on Halloween in 2019, which was more than we spent in the 2018 election of $5.7 billion. That was a midterm, so those are never as expensive. Now, this year, I think we're probably going to have a slightly more modest Halloween due to COVID-19, and the election money has really ballooned. The increase from 2012 to 2016 was 6.3 to 6.5 billion, and now we're looking at potentially $11 billion. So that's really a whole lot of money to be spending on the election. And how did it get that high? Well, presidential candidates alone have raised $3.15 billion. Now, that was, of course, aided by one candidate who spent $1 billion over the course of a 4-month campaign, which flamed out spectacularly. He ended up without, I think he won the electoral votes of American Samoa. That was, of course, Michael Bloomberg, and that was all his money. He spent $1 billion in 4 months and got nowhere with his campaign, thus proving that money is really not everything when it comes to campaigning. Now, if you want to know how the presidential candidates who are still in the race are doing, the president has raised $471.3 million, including $290 million in contributions of $200 or less. So that's actually a lot of small dollars coming into the race. Big small donor energy this year, and I think that's a good thing. Small dollar donors are generally less corrupting than the big mega donors, who I'll talk about a little bit in a couple of minutes. Joe Biden has raised $531 million, and of his $531 million haul, $299 million of that came in $200 or less, in increments of $200 or less. So a lot of money coming in small dollar donors. And as I said, I think a lot of people fixate on the totals because the numbers are so big. But I think the more important questions to ask are not how much money is being raised and spent, but how is it being raised and spent? Is it being done in a way that is legal? Is it being done in a way that's transparent? Is it being done in a way that minimizes the risk of corruption? And is it being done in a way that promotes political participation? So we seem to be getting a fair amount of political participation on the fundraising end, on people who are contributing, including people who are contributing at low dollar amounts. If you'd like to know how things are going in Colorado, I have some information for you. The quarterly reports that Senate candidates file, the next one is coming out on the 15th. So the numbers only go through the first half of the year. As of the first half of the year, Cory Gardner had raised $17 million, and John Hickenlooper had raised $14 million. However, Hickenlooper has come out and announced in advance of the actual filing deadline that he raised a pretty impressive $22.6 million in the third quarter. Unfortunately, I don't have the numbers for Cory Gardner for the third quarter because he hasn't announced that yet. But, this is shaping up to be a pretty expensive race. Outside spending in the overall has already passed the $1 billion mark. And one interesting frame on all this money is, as Professor Malveaux was saying at the beginning, this is a time when we're all thinking about racial justice issues. So how do race and gender play out in the campaign finance context? Most of the big donors, the mega donors who contribute millions of dollars through super PACs, are still old white men. There are more women coming into the fundraising game, but it's still predominantly an old white men game. Women tend to want to support women candidates, so there have been a lot more women candidates, obviously in 2016, but also at the congressional level in 2018, there were a lot of women candidates. So that brought more women into donating. But I think you also want to look at it from an intersectional point of view. Women actually outraised men on average in 2018, but Black women had a much harder time raising money. They raised the least amount of money in 2018, if you break it down by race and gender. They are more likely to run in safer, poorer districts, and the money tends to go to the more competitive seats. But it is a little bit disturbing that the average for white women candidates in general in 2018 was $1.9 million, whereas for Congress in the general election, whereas Black women only raised an average of $900,000. However, that doesn't apply across the board. Kamala Harris seems to be a big draw when it comes to fundraising. In the 2 days following the announcement of her that she was going to be the VP pick on the Biden ticket, the Biden-Harris ticket raised $48 million in 2 days, and we have brand new news about one candidate who's doing spectacularly well, having broken every record on one candidate raising money for a Senate race in 1 quarter. Jamie Harrison, a Black candidate who is running against a white incumbent in South Carolina, Lindsey Graham, Harrison announced that in the 3rd quarter he raised an astonishing $57 million. 1.5 million donations from 994,000 donors, according to Mr. Harrison's campaign, with an average contribution of $37. As I said, there's a lot of energy among small dollar donors in this cycle. But let's talk about the big money for a couple of minutes. In the decade since Citizens United, and let me acknowledge I'm relying on some analysis from the Center for Responsive Politics, opensecrets.org, great website if you're into this stuff and you want to geek out on money and politics issues. In the decade since Citizens United, $4.5 billion has been spent by outside non-party groups, super PACs and other groups that are not either party groups or the candidates themselves. $1.2 billion has been given to candidates and parties and other groups over that decade by the top 10 donors. And almost $1 billion in dark money has been spent, which I think is a big problem. If you look again at 2018, 126 donors gave over $1 million or more. 32 donors gave $5 million or more. 14 donors gave $10 million or more. And then there was one family that gave $124 million. And if you want to look at how it's playing out in this race, again, putting aside the money that people are putting into their own races, already over 100 donors have given over $2 million apiece overall to outside spending groups and to candidates. 36 have given $5 million or more, 18 have given $10 million or more, and 3 have given $50 million or more. And what we are seeing is an increasing trend towards these outside spending groups actually outspending the candidates themselves. So if you look at 2018, 2016, 2014, in each of those years, 6 or 7 out of the top 10 Senate races in terms of the amount of money that was raised and spent, in 6 or 7 out of those 10 races, there was more money raised and spent by outside spending groups than there was by the candidates themselves. So this is really also changing the dynamic of who you're getting your message from, how you're learning about the candidates themselves. And polls show that people don't really like this system of endless money flowing through these outside groups, funded largely by these very, very wealthy mega donors, because the truth is, and we all know this, that people who are at the very, very, very top sliver of the economic scale are not necessarily going to have the same issues of concern as the rest of us, and certainly not of the people who perhaps can't even afford to give a $25 donation. So I think it does skew the outcome not only of the elections, but what can get done in Congress, because members of Congress are responsive to the issues that their donors care about, and they worry a lot about a big donor getting mad and funding a primary opponent in the next election. But the good news is they don't only worry about donors, they also worry about voters, because when it comes right down to it, money isn't everything. There have been a number of very wealthy candidates who raised a lot of money, whether their campaigns were wealthy. Sometimes they are also personally wealthy, raised a lot of money and still didn't get elected. Hillary Clinton raised more money than Donald Trump in 2016, and she lost. Michael Bloomberg spent $1 billion and didn't go anywhere this year. So money isn't everything. Voting matters a lot. Going back to one of my heroes along the same lines as Professor Malveaux, John Lewis, said in his final words to us in an op-ed that was published posthumously posthumously. Democracy is not a state. It is an act, and each generation must do its part. The vote is the most powerful nonviolent change agent you have in a democratic society. You must use it because it is not guaranteed. You can lose it. So let's talk for a minute about who votes and who doesn't, because this really matters. In 2016, just over 60% of the eligible voters actually turned out and voted. And of that 60%, if you look at voters who are 65 years and older, almost 71% of them turned out. If you look at voters who are in the 18 to 29 year range, only 46% turned out. And that kind of discrepancy has been pretty standard. In 2018, 66% of older voters turned out, 36% of younger voters turned out. And if you go back to 2014, which was a particularly low turnout election, almost 60% of the older voters turned out and only 20% of the younger voters turned out. Now, if you are the sort of person who thinks that midterms don't matter, let me tell you about the 2014 election when we had the lowest turnout in 70 years. Only 36% of eligible voters overall turned out. 36%. Over 60% of the eligible voters didn't bother to vote. In that election, control of the Senate flipped hands from Democratic hands to Republican hands, and that is why in 2016, Mitch McConnell was in charge of the Senate and was in a position to deny Merrick Garland a hearing for a seat on the Supreme Court. Now, you may think that was a terrific result, or you may think it was a terrible result. Any way you look at it, it was a supremely consequential result. And it happened as the result of an election in which 60% of the eligible voters didn't even bother to turn out. So it is really important to turn out, even in midterms. And I can tell you that politicians really do look at the turnout when they consider what issues they're going to move forward on and what issues they can afford to ignore. There is a reason why Social Security is the third rail of politics and not student loan debt, because politicians look at these numbers and they know that young people don't turn out and vote, and therefore they don't feel that they have to be quite as accountable to the younger people. So I say to all of the students who are listening to me, and I hope there are a lot of you out there, that your turnout and getting your people, your generation, your friends, your cousins, that person you don't even like that much out to vote makes a difference in terms of whether your concerns are going to be reflected in the policy of your government. Plus, it is the ultimate okay boomer to say to the baby boomer generation, we will turn out, we got this, we're going to choose who the next president is going to be and who the leaders will be in the Senate and in the House. So I hope that you will all turn out for the election. I can speak to a bunch of other issues. You know, you want to talk about foreign money, you want to talk about tech companies. I mean, there's all sorts of issues that we could talk about in relation to this election, but I do want to leave the opportunity for questions. I promised that I would not talk too long to make sure that we had plenty of time for that. So let me stop here and I will see what people would like me to talk about.
Great, thank you for that. That's extremely interesting. Let's get into questions. The first question from Alice Madden says, what do the cost estimates of elections include? Government spending, campaign spending?
When I talk about these dollar figures, this is what candidates, party committees, super PACs are spending on the election. This doesn't address the administrative costs of the election. That's in a whole different pocket, and it varies state by state.
Right. Yeah, I'm sure it's multifaceted. A question from Professor Doug Spencer. You alluded to the fact that not enough money is being spent on the election, parentheses, administration, but perhaps too much money is being spent on election, parentheses, campaigning. Are you more concerned about how much money is spent or where the money is coming from? If the latter, complaints often focus on how few donors there are in federal elections. Do you think that the number of donors is the problem, or are there other concerns?
Well, as I said, I'm I'm not sure. I don't think that I would say that I think too much money is being spent. A lot of money is being spent this election. But if if it's coming in small dollar donations and people are energized and they want to support the candidates of their choice, the fact that it all adds up to a lot of money, I think is not. I think that's not necessarily where we ought to be focusing our attention. I do worry about the disproportionate influence of the big donors and how that affects the kind of policies that government is willing to tackle. Once the government is elected, they're still worried about being responsive to their big donors, or as I said, about the kind of money that could be spent running against them if they go against the wishes of big donors. So to take an issue like climate change, I have heard Senator Sheldon Whitehouse of Rhode Island tell this story. This isn't my story, but I think it's in a book that he wrote a couple of years back, that he's very concerned about climate change and he's very concerned about money in politics. And several of his colleagues have apparently kind of snuck up to him on the sly, his colleagues on the Republican side, and acknowledged that climate change is a big problem. They understand it's not a hoax. They say they would like to work with him to try and do something about it, but they know that there are very wealthy donors in the fossil fuel industry who would spend a whole lot of money to oust them in their next primary, probably, if they were to work on this issue with him. So therefore, they can't. And that's a very concrete example of how the power of big money really skews whether we can tackle big issues in Congress, because the key issue shouldn't be, what do the big donors think? The key issue should be, what do the American people think? And I think that we do have a system that interferes with that kind of reasoned judgment.
Thank you. That is concerning.
It is, isn't it? We need a better system.
Yes. Anonymous attendee asks, are there any reforms you can think of that would expand the pool of donors to be more inclusive of minority voices?
Well, I think that we are probably seeing some expansion of that this year. It depends on whether there are candidates that they're excited about giving to. And as I said, the guy that smashed all the records in the Senate is a Black man running in South Carolina, which is and he's running as a Democrat. Democrats haven't won a statewide race in South Carolina, I think, since 1998. So, but it is now seen as a very competitive race, in part because of all the money that is flowing in. I would support a stronger public funding system at the federal level. We used to have public funding for the presidential, not for congressional races, and it worked pretty well for 25, 30 years. But started in the 1970s, but starting in the 2000s, in the early 2000s, candidates started to figure out that they could raise more money privately than they could using the public funding system. And the public funding system comes with spending caps, which otherwise you don't have. So we need a system that provides better incentives to candidates to participate in it. I mean, the public funding system at the presidential level still exists, but no major candidate uses it because it's not going to work for them. They're going to be dramatically outspent. There are robust matching programs at some state and local levels. New York City has something like a 9-to-1 match on small dollar donations, so that really encourages small donors to give because they know that their money will really matter, and it encourages candidates to reach out for the small dollar donations. The city of Seattle has a really innovative program called Democracy Vouchers, where voting age citizens of the municipality get 4 $25 vouchers that they can give to the candidate of their choice. And that really changes the incentives for the candidates. So whereas before they would have the incentive to go where they thought they would find likely voters or where they thought they would find likely donors, now everybody counts. Everybody matters. Every citizen has something of value that provides an incentive for the candidates to go into perhaps neighborhoods that they never used to go to because they didn't have high turnout and they didn't have a lot of money to give. But now everybody's got something of value to trade. So I think there are interesting and innovative ideas out there at the state and local level. There's a proposal in Congress to try out democracy vouchers as a pilot program at the federal level, as well as to expand public funding at the federal level, although you'd need to take the caps off. Otherwise, it's not going to work. Nobody's going to participate if they're going to feel like they're going to end up with less money at the end of the day than they otherwise could have to fight a hard-fought race.
Thank you. So I also have a question. You've mentioned how this election might take time, perhaps time that kind of the American populace isn't used to. And it seems that we're in a situation in which a lot of kind of online groups that are a result of micro-targeting and kind of like the radicalization through algorithm sort of are increasingly kind of instigating doubt in the election. What I suppose, sorry, this is, do you have any concerns that kind of these kind of online groups that have been created through micro-targeting will react poorly to the time that this election might take to get results?
Well, I mean, it's not just online groups, right? There are some pretty famous people out there who have been trying to cast doubt on mail-in voting, for example, which has been done safely in this country since the Civil War. Abraham Lincoln started mail-in voting in the Civil War because he didn't want to bring his soldiers home from the fight in order to vote. And the military frequently votes by mail. There are 5 states, including, I think, Colorado. You're one of the mail-in voting states, aren't you? So you do it really well. You know that mail-in voting works, and it can be done safely and securely, and it increases turnout. Now, there are going to be a bunch of states around the country that do not have mail-in voting. I mean, they've had it, but not to the extent that Colorado has had it. They are not used to having as many people vote by mail as will happen in this election. And it's going to take them a little longer to count. There are several states, including some key swing states, where they're not allowed to start processing the ballots until Election Day. And that includes Pennsylvania and Wisconsin. In Michigan, they just passed a law to let them start processing the ballots one day before Election Day. So that's not really a lot of time. If you're expecting millions of ballots to come in, you got to open the ballots, check the signatures, make sure they're all valid, and then count them. And a lot of that can be done by these high-speed computers, but not every jurisdiction was able to afford to buy the high-speed computers because they didn't get the money that really would have been helpful earlier this year. In Michigan, I think the Secretary of State has predicted that she thinks she can have the result by Friday. Not going to know on Tuesday, but she thinks that she'll know by Friday. And there's no point in calling the election on Tuesday night if you know that you've got millions and millions of ballots still outstanding that you haven't counted yet, because the result is not real. What we want is an accurate count. Every person's vote should count, and every person's vote should be counted. And if that takes a few days longer, then we, as I said in my op-ed with historian Professor Kevin Cruz at Princeton, we look back over other elections where we didn't know on election night. It wouldn't be the first time that we wouldn't know on election night. It is better to get an accurate result than a quick result. And we can do this. I think that there has been a lot of publicity on this issue. It's one of the reasons I wrote about it earlier this year, but I'm not the only one. There are a lot of voices speaking out about this. And I think that recent polls show that a majority of Americans actually do understand and accept that we're probably not going to know on election night. Will some people say we need to know now? Yeah, but the rest of us are just going to have to be mature about it and not listen to the people who are trying to incite a lack of faith in the election, because the fact that the votes take a few more days to count does not mean that there's any kind of fraud or nefarious activity going on. What it really means is that we're trying to get an accurate count where everyone's voice is heard, and that is the most important thing. The Declaration of Independence says that the government derives its just powers from the consent of the governed, and this is how we give our consent. It's through the ballot box. It's through voting, and it can be done safely, and we can wait for the results. And I believe we will have results, if not on election night, that the American people should be able to have faith in.
Great, thank you. As an American, I'm opposed to delayed gratification. Just kidding. We have another anonymous question. You mentioned that the FEC has no quorum. Campaign finance laws require the FEC to be involved before litigation. If the FEC can't act, is there any hope that violations can be prevented or prosecuted?
Well, there is a 5-year statute of limitations, so it's not as if there isn't any law, but we can't do anything about it right now. Now, that's a bad situation, and I am frankly dumbfounded that it has gone on for as long as it has. We've had, as I said, we're supposed to have 6 commissioners, so it's been like 3.5 years now since one of my colleagues left and was not replaced, and then about 2.5 years since another colleague left and was not replaced. And at the end of last August, a third colleague left and was not replaced until June. But almost as soon as the replacement came in, another commissioner announced that she was leaving, and then we lost the quorum again by the end of the month. So for more than a calendar year, going back to last September 1st, we have only had a quorum for less than a month from September 1st till now. And that is just mind-blowing to me. I cannot believe that it has lasted this long. The president needs to make a nomination and the Senate needs to confirm. And, you know, it seems like the Senate's pretty good at confirming people when they're motivated to do so. The president has nominated a replacement for the last commissioner who left. There's, still 2 other seats that are vacant. I don't know why they don't fill them. But I don't know when that vote is going to happen. I'm not holding my breath. It might not happen this year. Now, the good news is that most people actually try to comply with the law. And we have a lot of people, the entire agency is still working. It's just the commissioners who can't fully do our job. But the analysts are still collecting the information and analyzing it. We're still getting all of this important campaign finance information up on the website. So that's how I can tell you about how much money is being raised and spent. Everything that you read about in the newspapers or wherever you get your news about how much money is being raised and spent and who's supporting which candidates, all of that is it derives from the data that we collect and then we make public, and that function goes on. Our lawyers are still analyzing the complaints that come in and teeing them up for a decision for the commissioners once we resume a quorum. We've got several hundred cases in the backlog now, which is not a good situation. And I do worry that the more aggressive actors out there will feel emboldened by the lack of a quorum to push the envelope more than they might otherwise. They could say, well, I didn't have any way of getting conclusive advice from the commission. We have staff that answer questions, but there's also an advisory opinion process whereby anybody can write in and say, I need an answer as to how my conduct comports with the law and whether I can do this or that. And I'm sure that there will be people who will argue after the fact. I didn't have that mechanism available to me, so I just made my best guess and went ahead and some of them will probably do things that are fairly aggressive. So I think it is a big problem. We will get to all the cases in the backlog, but we're not going to do it in the timely way that I think the American people deserve. So it's a problem. It's a problem that the president and the Senate could solve and could have solved at any time in the last year, but they just haven't done it.
Just as a quick follow-up, how uncommon is it to have open seats for that amount of time?
Well, to have a lack of quorum, I mean, there have been any number of times where we haven't had a full complement of 6 commissioners, but up until last September 1st, there had only been one period of time in the agency's history, going back to 1975, when we lost the quorum, and that was in 2008, and we didn't have the quorum for a period of about 6 months. But then the quorum was restored in advance of the election that year. Obviously, that was another presidential election year. So this is either depending on whether you count this as once or twice, since it went from September to June, we had the quorum and then we lost the quorum and then it started up again. This is either the second or third time that this has happened in the history of the agency. And overall, it's obviously the longest.
That's pretty striking. Patricia Peterson says, you note the difference between the $4 billion recommended to support the 2020 election and the $400 million that was appropriated. What things should have been done that are not being done because of the lower appropriation?
Well, I mean, I think that is forcing some hard decisions on a state by state basis. I think probably Colorado is in pretty good shape because they were already planning on doing a fully mail-in election. So they already had all the equipment and they know how to do that. So you guys are in great shape in Colorado. But there are a lot of states where they needed to buy more equipment, or they needed to hire more staff, or these large machines that process the ballots in very quick time, those are very expensive, and they have to be bought and ordered months in advance. There has been, as I said, there have been some folks that have chipped in. I mean, if they don't have to rent space if a basketball team donates their arena, so that's pretty great. But I think there's a lot. I think that as well as being patient with the timing, we're going to have to be patient with the process. There will be long lines in some places because there will be cutbacks on the number of spaces that are available for in-person voting. And by the way, if any of you have friends in other states, since this isn't really a concern in Colorado, there is a real shortage of poll workers because a lot of poll workers tend to be senior citizens. A lot of them are feeling vulnerable due to COVID-19 and are not turning up this year. So there's a real need for younger people who are young and healthy and feel like they're able to do this, to donate their time as poll workers, which is often a paid job, by the way. It's not just a question of volunteering, although it is a great civic engagement opportunity to do something good for your democracy. Paying more poll workers, that's another place where there could be budget shortfalls. And as you probably know, due to COVID-19, the tax base is shrinking and a lot of states and localities are hurting. This is not a time when anybody's got a lot of money lying around. So we've got a lot of well-intentioned, hardworking administrators throughout the country who are going to be overstressed and under-resourced. And, mistakes can happen. And again, we're going to have to be calm about that and not assume that every mistake is a sign of some huge nefarious plot, because there's really not that many nefarious plots out there that I could go on at great length about all the reasons why we should feel comfortable that there isn't a lot of voter fraud out there. Again, I think that you guys are pretty comfortable with the mail-in system in Colorado. There are a lot of people who are alarmed about this throughout the country, being ginned up a little bit by some people who really ought to know better. But there have been study after study that show that voter fraud is extraordinarily rare. It really happens in an infinitesimal number of cases. I did a 66-part tweet storm on this earlier this year, just with piling up dozens of sources of people who've been refuting this story about voter fraud. I could do another one today and probably come up with another equally long set of brand new sources who have since then refuted these claims. So this is not something that people should be worried about. But again, mistakes may happen. There could be things that go wrong. And hopefully they will not be the kind of mistakes that will cause voter disenfranchisement or get in the way of an accurate count.
Right. I that kind of just from what you said earlier about the long lines, I feel like that's such a kind of a striking image now in particular, when it could potentially be dangerous actively because it's such a large gathering of people. Ashley Boothby says, I would love to hear your reactions about Proposition 22, the gig economy proposition, exempting transportation companies from employment protections in California. It is the most expensive ballot initiative in California history, more than $180 million spent by Uber, Lyft, DoorDash, Instacart, and labor has only raised about $4 million in opposition.
Well, I think this is I'm just going by the information that was in the question, because we don't have jurisdiction over ballot initiatives. We don't have jurisdiction over issues that are purely at the state and local level. But it's emblematic of a lot of issues, I think, where you have some big special interest that has a lot of money to spend, and they flood the market with advertising and with other information, and the other side is really it's not a fair fight. They don't have the same kind of resources. Interestingly enough, the Supreme Court, as part of their campaign finance jurisprudence, has actually dismissed the very notion of a level playing field, which they consider to be antithetical to the First Amendment. You can't level the playing field, because then you're basically telling somebody that they can't spend as much money as they would otherwise like to spend and are able to spend, and that means that they can't speak as much as they want to. I mean, there are different ways of approaching this issue. This is, I find this to be a very strange statement, that, we don't want a level playing field in politics. I can't think of any other competition that we have where we don't want to have a level playing field. We don't want to have the competitors have an equal shot at resources and at potentially winning. We wouldn't run a sports competition where one side had uniforms and the other side, didn't have the padding or the helmets. I mean, it's just hard to imagine. Now the Supreme Court feels like this is the way, and this goes back to Buckley v. Vallejo in 1976. This isn't a new development. This isn't something that comes from Citizens United. This is longstanding Supreme Court doctrine that any kind of limits on spending in order to equalize the resources, the opportunities, is a bad thing, according to them, and is contrary to the First Amendment. Now, because they want to protect, they have good goals. They want to protect the people's opportunities to speak, and they want to protect the opportunity for a dynamic and robust and full-throated debate. Well, that's great, but it's not the only way to get there. It's maybe not even the best way to get there. In Canada, for example, when they were confronted with this same issue about spending limits, they said, if you don't have limits on spending, then the side with more resources is going to drown out the other arguments, and the voters will not have equal access to all the arguments that they need to hear in order to make a fair and informed decision. So in the interest of having the most robust, dynamic debate where all the issues get fully aired, they think it is essential to have spending limits, where our Supreme Court thinks it is absolutely antithetical to our goals to have spending limits. I do not. I don't think that we get the best results this way. I am concerned that, we get a system that is increasingly weighted towards the people who have more money to spend to accomplish their goals. And that's not necessarily what's in the best interest of all the citizens. So I'm troubled by that those rules would be set by the California Fair Political Practices Commission, which would regulate how ballot initiatives get funded in California. And they've got some pretty good rules at the state level. But again, I don't think that they could adopt any kind of spending limit that would equalize the resources, because they would be challenged and the Supreme Court would probably strike it down.
Right. That's such a great way to put it, as kind of framing it as a matter of preventing voices from being drowned out by others, rather than preventing individuals from spending to their heart's desire.
And you can,
from
if you looked at the list, sorry to interrupt you.
No,
If you looked at the list of the top 100 donors, and you can find this list on the Open Secrets website, you would not recognize most of these names. There's a couple of famous names in there. Steven Spielberg is in there, J.J. Abrams, but most of these names you wouldn't even recognize. And these people are playing an inordinately powerful role, and nobody knows who they are, and nobody knows what interests they're pushing. So I think that's a big problem. And those are the ones we know about. There are also people who are spending money through shell corporations, through LLCs, through 501c4s that do not disclose their donors. That's the $1 billion in dark money that we've seen in the decades since Citizens United. And I think that is, an even bigger problem, and potentially masks not just shy billionaires who don't want to get grief from people for the political views that they're trying to push forward, but potentially illegal funders, potentially foreign donors. We don't know who's behind the dark money because it's dark.
I am surprised about J.J. Abrams. It's weird to think about money from television's Lost influencing our elections in the modern day.
I don't know. This year is seeming a little bit lost to me. All we're missing is the smoke monster,
Soon. Hopefully the ending will be better too. From Rachel.
Certainly more conclusive.
I hope so. I hope it'll make more sense too. From Raleigh Levine, we are seeing so much litigation nationwide over broadening absentee voting eligibility, with different state and federal courts reaching different conclusions. The court in Andino just reinstated South Carolina's witness signature requirement, although it upheld a consent decree reached in Rhode Island, waiving a similar requirement. Do you see the different results as based on the presence or absence of a consent decree? And do you think that it's likely that all of these cases can be finally resolved by the safe harbor deadline?
I think the Supreme Court is not going to be able to take up all the cases that some people might want to present to it. They're just not going to be able to hear all the cases. There are a lot of lawsuits going on. What troubles me the most about this is that in deciding these cases, the Supreme Court does not seem to put, or at least a majority of the Supreme Court does not seem to put a value on how do we make sure that the largest number of citizens have an opportunity to vote safely, accessibly. A lot of people feel this year, this was a very challenging year in very many ways, and it absolutely affects the election. Everything else that's going on, the health pandemic affects the election, the economic downturn affects the election, the social justice and racial justice movement also affects the election. And it's been the longstanding viewpoint of a majority of Supreme Court justices that they don't put a thumb on the scale in favor of allowing more people to vote. Now they claim to be following a principle of not wanting to make changes too close to the election, but sometimes it is their decision that makes the changes too close to the election. So if you look at the South Carolina situation, I'm actually, and this is, as I've said, a really hot race with lots and lots of money. I hope that some of that money is going to be spent on helping to educate the voters on how to fill out their ballots, because those ballots have already been printed with information saying you don't need the witness this year. Normally, state law says you have to have a witness for an absentee ballot, which is, excessive, I think, but most states don't require that. And it's particularly in a year where you're supposed to be social distancing. If you're quarantining at home and you're social distancing, how are you supposed to get a witness to sign your ballot? So the South Carolina authorities decided they were going to waive that requirement this year. They printed material that said it goes in with the ballots. You don't need to have the signature. People are still getting that information. So they're getting the wrong information because the Supreme Court has said, no, you have to reinstate that law that says you need a witness. And it's very troubling to me that the Supreme Court does not place a higher priority on providing a voice for more people.
Absolutely. We have one more question from anonymous attendee. Your bio mentioned concerns over dark money and foreign influence. How concerned are you that foreign individuals and or corporations are spending money on our elections? And are these foreign voices influential? And should we be concerned?
Well, the intelligence community has told us that, as we know, in 2016, the Russians tried to intervene in our elections. They tried to spread a lot of disinformation. They are doing it again. The Chinese, the Iranians. I mean, who all knows all the people that are that may be trying to do that? I think that the biggest risk is through disinformation, not through them actually trying to directly spend money, but we have seen instances of foreign money coming in through domestic subsidiaries, through shell corporations, and I'm sure there is other money that we are not aware of. This year, I think what we're seeing, unfortunately, is that the Russians are amplifying disinformation that starts right here in the United States. There are a lot of domestic actors who are spreading disinformation, sometimes, completely innocently, not realizing that it's bad information. And most recently, the intelligence community has said that one of the part of the disinformation that the Russians are trying to spread is a fake story that they have hacked into voter databases because they're trying to cause us to distrust the election. They want to have us all up in arms and at each other's throats and not trusting our democracy. They want to make the democracy look bad because they don't want their citizens to start demanding a greater say in how the government works. So anytime we look bad, it's good for them. And they are not actually, the intelligence community, DHS, the local authorities have been working on this since 2016. They've been working together to try and harden their resources against hacking. I'm not going to say it's absolutely impossible that it could happen, but it is a lot less likely now than it was 2 or 4 years ago. But rather than hacking the machinery, they're trying to hack our brains. They're just trying to make us, if they can make us think that they've hacked in, they don't have to hack in. They get the same result that way because nobody will trust the results. And I think that we have to be resilient and savvy consumers of the information that we're seeing online, particularly these days when a lot of people are spending a lot of time at home and they're not engaging in the kind of normal, running into people, hanging out around the water cooler activities where you might say, hey, I read this interesting thing. And then the person you're talking to might say, oh my gosh, that's not true. And here are the 5 reasons why it isn't. We are missing that kind of reality check that we normally have in our life. So I think we have to be extra cautious about verifying information, making sure it's coming from a reputable source before we trust it, and certainly before we share it.
Absolutely. It's pretty unreal. Like whenever there's some kind of conspiratorial thing trending on Twitter, and to go to like Bot Sentinel, which tracks Twitter bots that are promoting hashtags, to see how many of them are boosting that story. It's a little frightening. We're about hitting time. Is there any kind of last words, last statement that you want to go out on?
Vote. Encourage everyone you know to vote. This is how we have a strong and responsive democracy. It's when everybody takes part. So I hope that you all will do that. And I thank you for your attention.
Yeah, thank you so much for coming to speak with us. It's been a huge honor to talk to you, and very, very, very informative, if not a little bit unsettling sometimes. So
we can do this.
Yes, voter turnout and it all. So that's it for this webinar. I want to remind everybody that the White Center is hosting Professor Kiara Bridges from UC Berkeley, who's going to be doing a primer on critical race theory on Monday, November 16th at noon Mountain Time. And thank you everybody for attending.